Hi, I'm Leanpub from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Michael Feathers. Based in California, Michael is the founder and director of R7K Research and Conveyance, a company specializing in software and organization design. Throughout his career, he has consulted hundreds of organizations, supporting them with general software design issues, process change, and code revitalization. He's a popular conference speaker and is also the author of the influential book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. You can follow him on Twitter at mfeathers and check out his Substack at michaelfeathers.substack.com. Michael is the author of the Leanpub book, AI-Assisted Programming. In this interview, we're going to talk about Michael's background and career, professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience as an author. So thank you very much, Michael, for being on the Leanpub Front Matter podcast.
Thanks for inviting me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you found yourself interested in career in technology and computers.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I haven't really sort of thought of, going back to the beginning with that sort of thing. But I grew up in Miami, Florida, and went to a local high school there. I spent a good deal of time right after high school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to go and do, right? And it took me a little while to go and sort of jump into college. As a teenager, I had some friends who got into computing with early TRS-80 computers and stuff along those lines. And I remember looking at this stuff and saying, wow, this is utterly fascinating. But it's if I get into it now, I'll basically miss my teenage years in a way. But I actually didn't start programming until early 20s or so. But I've always been fascinated by technology, and not just technology, just things in general. So I've always been an extremely curious person and read all the time and just, fan out into many different things. So I went to college and basically started majoring in architecture, discovered I don't draw well, switched majors to mathematics. And then I thought, okay, this is nice and fun, but it doesn't feel like I'm doing anything for people, right? And then decided to move into engineering, and that just eventually became computer science because that was the hot thing I was interested in. And did that and spent a good deal of time working with a company that was local then within Miami, Beckman Coulter, I believe is the name now. And it was fun to basically sort of join them, and they basically had me write a compiler for a programming language and design it as well. It's my first task, right, solo. And I did a lot of stuff related to instrument, control and stuff along those lines as well. And it was a fascinating, crucible experience, for me. And essentially in those days, it was the 90s, practically everybody worked by themselves. There wasn't really very much teamwork when you're siloed in a cubicle. And it's kind of like you against the machine, and you got to basically do well, and a lot of stress and anxiety about the entire thing. But the rewards basically were just really, really great. Around the turn of the century, around 2000 or so, I started going to conferences. I met up with several people who became seminal in the early extreme programming movement. And I, at that time, working at a biomedical company that was FDA regulated, I kind of felt wow, there must be a different way of going and writing software, just because we had so much process in what we were doing. So I became very interested in that. I got myself embedded in some communities and got hired by Robert Martin, basically in the early 2000s, an object mentor, to go and do consulting work. And it was very fun to go and actually just expand my range, basically go and visit all these teams and working in various different technologies, and started to see the commonalities of different domains and stuff along those lines. So I spent a good deal of time doing that, and then eventually decided to go out on my own. And I've done a couple of stints, with different companies, as an employee. But the main thing has been basically being, a consultant and basically helping people get better at things. Now with the legacy code thing, it was right around the time, 2003, 2004, when a lot of these agile methods were just kind of moving forward and becoming a little bit more mainstream. And we had a big problem then. And the problem was that we were telling everybody to refactor their code, but the little thing that was kind of, hidden away was you should have tests before you do this. And at that time in the industry, there just really wasn't very much of that. So I started encountering that problem with many different clients and started collecting strategies to really approach those. And that really became the seed, really of the book that I wrote, Working with Legacy Code. And spent an awful lot of time. I felt in the beginning that, I would do this, get this book out, or basically move on to something which is kind of the next thing in newer technology and stuff like that. But I ended up spending about 20 years seeing some of the worst code in the world, because you get called in as the book author for these problems. And
right.
Got a lot more experience, but it was also not the direction I expect my career to go. But I am happy because I've had a number of people just come up to me and say, this really made a difference to me. And that means a lot to me.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for sharing that story. There's a couple of things I'd like to threads I'd like to pull on there. The first is what was studying computer science like when you studied it? We've had people on the podcast from various different vintages, and it's always interesting to hear about what it was like. Did you have your own computer?
At that time, no. And it was really interesting. Well, okay, so I went to a community college first before going to like a 4-year college. And the thing that was interesting is I took a Fortran course, and essentially you had to submit your program and wait and get the answers back. And I just decided to, just skip the class. I decided it's like, I don't want to do this. It just doesn't feel right. But when I started to go and actually get serious about programming, I, as a mathematics major, I basically got a job doing data entry for a company that was writing software, and I had access to a computer, and I used to do a lot of interesting things with it. But yeah, computer science was interesting because I had done a little bit of programming before I got there. And the first thing that they wanted to teach us was the language Pascal, right? And I had already taught myself the C programming language. And I was just amazed by the things that you couldn't do in Pascal that you could do in C. And it was kind of a mesmerizing experience. I felt really happy that I got into school having had a little bit of experience first, because that tends to kind of like, when you experience the real world a bit prior to doing your schooling, you start to go and understand what's important, what isn't in the outside world. And that was a very helpful thing for me. But yeah, just, in-person classes, lots of the school I went to, computer science was a sub-department of mathematical sciences, which was a sub-department of mathematics. So there was really much more of a focus on understanding computation theory and various things, and then like one section on software engineering. So there was a lot around process and software maintenance and all these other things that just really wasn't as much in the curriculum. It was really more about understanding why things work and being able to go and sort of, just a lot of theory, just kind of fascinating. So.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too. You mentioned when you started working in the 90s, being siloed as well, and I see it's really interesting as a kind of segue from like the technology has changed, the programming languages have burgeoned and changed as well, but the ways that people work together changed, and particularly I would guess. I mean, don't have a computer science background myself, but I've interviewed lots of people who do, and there was no when you were in your cubicle. You probably not only did you not have sort of a teammate kind of situation, but like you didn't have Stack Overflow or Reddit.
Well, had lots of books. But that's about it.
Yeah.
And the internet was just becoming a bit popular at that point in time. At college, I had access to use that as some of the early discussion forums. That was kind of helpful in a way. And I got access to that. I worked. It wasn't really the web yet or anything like that. The cool thing though was like we had our own cubicles, but I was around a lot of people that were roughly the same age as I was, but they were working in different domains. It was really a very multiple disciplinary area. We're working with engineers of various disciplines as well as just other software people, and working on different things. So I enjoyed it a lot. It was a fun first job.
And then I guess about 10 years later, you started working on your influential book. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you've already mentioned a little bit about where that come from, but there's this interesting story that you were on a podcast very recently that I watched preparing for this interview, where you talk a little bit about that, how you were in this sort of, I think, stressful situation. And you said, if it's legacy code, it doesn't have tests. And I was wondering let's say we're talking to people who don't know about computer science and stuff. And it's really interesting because it's a very influential book. What is legacy code and what are tests?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing because you can have as many different definitions as you want. To me, definitions are like walking around a thing and seeing from different vantage points. So, that saying, legacy code is code without tests, came to me when I was working with a team. And a friend of mine just sort of like said, hey, Mike, you should write that down and get that out there. It's kind of powerful. And if he hadn't said that, I probably would have never, sort of like remembered that and kind of gone forward with it. But the idea is this. It's kind of like, if you're not working with computers, you don't really see that we see different things, as programmers than most people do. It's kind of like we're kind of huddled under our computers and we're basically dealing with all these abstract structures that aren't really available to people's, perception in many ways. So it's kind of hard to believe that these abstract things can kind of decay over time or fall out of date or fall into disuse and disrepair. And the thing is, it's entropy. That happens in almost every system. It doesn't matter whether it's non-physical like that. So the thing about this is to write automated tests that exercise the system, and you put in the tests the expected values. Like I'm going to see if when I do this and this and this, I get 5 back or this particular string back. And if I get those answers back and I have them for a big swath of the system, then I have confidence that I understand what the system is doing. And if I change the system, the tests are going to fail and tell me where I've deviated from the previous behavior in my change. So the powerful thing, I think, that came from saying legacy code is code without tests, at least at that time in the industry, was that you can see that essentially, like when you can work with tests, you're in a much, much better state. It's kind of like the work is qualitatively different. You're able to kind of work without fear in a way. But without the test, it's like you're changing code and you can kind of run the application or whatever and see kind of what happens, but you don't really have much of a sense of the impact, whether things that you've done are actually breaking things silently that you weren't aware of at all. I guess that's how I would kind of like to sum that up.
Yeah, no, that's really great. I mean, whenever I think about tests, I always think about, I have a bit of background in, investment banking and financial modeling in Excel, which I didn't understand was a form of programming when I first learned how to do it. But one of the kind of tests that we used, the highest level test was like, did a change affect the calculated IRR, like the internal rate of return? And that would be down to like, the second, like a BIP, which was, the second decimal place or something like that. We were constantly looking at that to make sure, like if you changed something that wasn't supposed to change the outcome, but it did, you're like, oh no. And yeah, like there's like the analogy for that is like, like how did this change and make affect the output of the system? Did it affect it? If it shouldn't have, how can I be sure that it didn't? But of course, one of the problems with that is that building a test. Now, the one I describe is kind of like a kind of cheap, easy version of a test. But the kind of thing you're describing, you can imagine maybe you have a non-technical manager sitting on top of a team of 20 programmers with limited time for each of them. And then someone, maybe a consultant comes in and says, hey, you need to do tests. And they're like, well, how much is that going to slow me down? Do I need to hire a new person or something like that? So what in your experience, I mean, I know you've had so much experience with this, but like, how do you argue for that case if you're talking to people on the business side of things?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because things have gotten better since I wrote the book, but the entire thing is just basically going and pointing to all the time that people lose when they can't track down errors, when bad things happen and they basically get to the point where they're moving extremely slowly because they just are scared. They're really scared of going and making changes. And a lot of projects end up in that hellhole, really. It's kind of like, oh, I want to make this change. And it's like, everybody's like, yeah, we can do that, but it's going to take this much time because, it may not say that out loud, but it's just, we really, really need to know that this is right. And it's very, very difficult to know that it's right. So it's one of those things where you have a compounding effect. As you have more tests in place around the code that you're working on, you can move faster. But it's not something you're going to see immediately. It's just something that happens a bit easier, a bit more over time as you move forward. So yeah, you are going to go a little bit slower in the beginning. That's just life. But the thing is, it's kind of like what you're doing is you're making an investment in the quality that's going to pay you dividends going forward.
Yeah. What's the I think I've heard this saying attributed to like the Navy SEALs, but like smooth is fast, something like that, kind of like to place each step carefully, and you'll get it done faster because you won't slip, kind of attitude.
You can go back to an old adage like slow but steady wins the race.
Right. Yeah. For example. Yeah. It's fascinating too because as you say, things have gotten better over time. Some of these battles have been won, but they were hard fought. And I think one thing you've talked about as well is how you use the sort of emotional language talking about things. Like it can be very scary, this part of the code. Where things like that, people can be afraid to say things that are true about it that they know, because maybe they don't want to make someone else look bad, or they just know whoever they're talking to doesn't want to hear it. And I find it so interesting because like there's still many, this has gotten better too, but there are still persisting stereotypes about programming, that programming is programmers are antisocial, that programming is this very isolated thing. But another one is that it's unemotional. And it's certainly not.
No, it isn't, because we're people, right? So we have emotions even if we're not aware of them, right? And sometimes, I can find myself being really frustrated, not understanding why, and having to kind of like backtrack, like what's happened in the past hour that's really set me off, that kind of thing. And, if you're interested in being, having like high performance or just basically doing better or even feeling better, all those things align together in very nice ways. So it's kind of funny, the stuff I'm writing around now, the AI stuff, a lot of it is really in that space of kind of like dealing with fatigue and dealing with like managing your state as you're going and working with things. Because as much as AI makes some things easier, it does make some other things harder. We end up doing more code review and stuff along those lines. So yeah, I think managing your expectations, managing your emotional state a bit is a really useful thing. And I think it's powerful to talk to people at that level, because quite often, if they are receptive to the topic, they'll realize that this is something that, is really meaningful. It's kind of like you can't really have the technical conversations extremely independent of that, so.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, that the feeling of safety that one can get from having, in particular, tests in the code, and knowing if going into a code base that's new to you and seeing that the people before you put tests in there can kind of like maybe relax a little bit,
lower the blood pressure a bit, right? Heart rate goes down the entire time. Yeah.
And it's interesting too. One thing we talked about, becoming a consultant and working with Robert Martin and things like that, and seeing all these different code bases. And I think one thing you've talked about is how like best practices are not used everywhere.
That's true.
And it can be very surprising to come across like let's say an old system or something like that that's got a lot of problems and is still kind of working, but needs improvement.
Yeah, that happens. It's happening to me less frequently now. I think a lot of it just because of like my reputation in the industry. I get called into places that are really doing the best practice they know how, right? But occasionally I'll talk to people in the industry just in local area and stuff like that. And they're kind of like, they're dealing with things that I felt like we solved 20 years ago, but it's just because nobody's really thought that there could be a different way of doing things, or maybe the market that they're in, it really doesn't matter as much to them, that particular thing. So I am kind of amazed by this. I think that just the technology advances, and essentially it's kind of like the variance gets wider and wider over time. It's kind of like, there's people doing like, really, really old style programming someplace in the world. And, if it works for them, that's okay. But I think there's a lot of ways that we can be better if we choose to.
Yeah, definitely. And speaking of trying to do things better, just moving on to the subject of your latest book. So it's really interesting, obviously very, the hot topic on all of, you can't sort of open up a news site without AI being somewhere in there. Your book is called AI Assisted Programming. And one thing you're clear about, from the beginning is that, AI and assistants have been around when it comes to programming for a while now. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, what do we mean now when we're talking about AI?
Yeah, it's very strange because here I am writing this book, and I'm sure things are going to change drastically before the end of the year, or maybe before the end of next year as well, right? So even getting the terminology straight is kind of wild. So I'm using the word assistant in a very expansive sense. It's kind of like any resource, any technological resource you basically use to go and do your work, right? That, may be like informed by large language models, for instance. But yeah, with, I guess is that answering the question? It's like, what's defining by assistance?
Sort of, yeah, by assistance. But there's also the question of like, and I know like, it's always been a tricky concept. I've got a bit of a background philosophy of mine and stuff like that. So talking about artificial intelligence, it's like, even the people who made it up disagree about what it is and what it means, and have different terms that change over time and stuff like that. But like, let's say like you just learned about programming, and you're young and you're excited now, and like, you get the thrill that, people used to get when they got their first computer and they actually like could make an image appear or something like that. Now you've got sitting down with an AI and like maybe it produces a program for you or something like that. But you mentioned LLMs. So when we're talking about AI, we're talking about, in the current context, ever since basically ChatGPT came out and people could interface with it easily and like ask it questions, AI is something that basically I give input to and get output from, but it's doing a lot of work for me.
Yeah, that's fair. If I can carry it back, I think there's a fundamental problem, which is really like, even before this brand of AI, if we were basically getting code completion in our IDEs, in our development environments, it presents the same challenge. It's like, how do I know that this is right? How do I basically go and assess this and see that it really goes and fits with what I'm doing? It's the same thing as basically going to Stack Overflow or anyplace else on the web and basically copying a piece of code or reading an algorithm from a book or something along those lines. So I think the fundamental thing about how we actually deal with the uncertainty of that is the thing that is very important to me or interesting to me. But the way the technology is right now, I think, we're just starting out with the task of going and understanding that it's not just a tool in a way, right? And I think, like, here's an example. It's kind of like you can basically, with some AI right now, go ahead and say, okay, I want to do this, but I want you to ask me questions. And I basically use that information in order to go and do the thing, right? And that's not a typical thing of like me just going and saying, hey, tell me about this, or hey, do this for me, right? It's kind of like creating a thing that basically goes and sort of like queries you to go and get what you can offer to go and actually create the thing for you. And yeah, that's a very different thing for programmers. I think if we have the tool focus we've had historically, we kind of miss that because we just think of it as a thing that we talk to and tell to do things and ask for explanations. And I think it can be much more collaborative than we expect. And it's this thing of going and breaking out of the, our preconceptions that we have as programmers. I'll add another little piece to this as well. And one of them is that it took me a while with AI to realize that I don't have to be as precise as I need to be with programming, right? That you will misspell things and it gets it. You'll basically sort of like, you feel like you want to go and introduce some additional context to make sure that it's on the right track. But if you miss some of that context, it's actually going to be on the right track often anyway. So it's, it's a big acclimation, and a lot of it has to do with unlearning habits as opposed to learning new things. So.
Yeah, and in particular, I imagine for programmers, the habit of expecting the same input to deterministically kind of produce some output because AI will not do that.
That's gone, yeah.
Except maybe for very, very specific subtasks. And it's interesting, like in a sense, as we've talked about, it's been around for a while, but in a sense, it's kind of new. And when things are new, and you want to talk about them, we don't have a shared language yet because we don't have terms for things yet. And this is one of the things that I really enjoyed, like, your book so far. You dive right into basically the hardest problem in a sense, which is like, we need to have new terms and they need to be shared for us to be able to talk with each other about what we're doing. And because you don't want to have to like describe something fully every time.
Yes.
And it's both. And you use an example of how you did this with the term, you invented the term intralate. So you're really doing this with the AI that you were using at the time, but there's a sort of meta level where like we're doing this with each other as well, where we need to name these new terms. And you start with the term rough out, for example, from sculpting, which is a way of saying like, when someone starts work on a sculpture before it looks like what it's going to look like, it's a rough out. And you talk about the state that a kind of, I don't know, the state that
you're in process state for a thing that you're working on.
Yeah. And having this term, like what stage are you at in your programming task? Well, I'm still in the rough out stage or something like that.
Yeah. And it's a weird thing because I don't like to push that too far because I think sometimes it becomes a little overwhelming if you're reading something or talking to me about these things, because if those terms aren't really, out there in a way, they aren't really, the thing that, many people are really going and using, then it's kind of like, sounds like, alien speak in a sense. But I've long had this feeling where it's kind of like that there are so many more concepts in the world than there are words for, right? And if you look at the research around LLMs, one of the things that they've been doing recently is trying to go and understand different patterns that happen in the weights of the models. And I think they sort of, I'm trying to remember the proper, I think it's like 60 million or 600 million discernible patterns inside of LLMs. And those could actually be concepts. And you can actually see, you can look backwards from those patterns and see what other things match them. And it's almost like, wow, these are things that exist, but we don't have words for, right? Another thing, as a kid, I read this book called Cat's Cradle by Kurt Vonnegut. And he basically talked about like, in the novel, basically like encountering a bunch of people in the Pacific Islands, and they had completely different terminology for things. They created their own language. And it was just this thing of kind of like, the inventiveness to me is just kind of interesting as well. So I enjoy doing it, and I have to kind of temper it because I enjoy doing it.
Well, I need, it's fun. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a really interesting challenge. I mean, both for technical writing, but like for basically writing about any domain, right? Because like, for example, I remember talking to a young software engineer that we had as an employee once, and he's like, why should anyone read literature? And I was like,
Yeah.
well, that's an important question to ask. And I tried to give him an answer that would be sort of like meaningful in terms that he would accept. And so I said something along the lines like, if you and I have both read Shakespeare, and I say, we're talking about a potential new employee, and I say he's more of a Hamlet than a Hotspur. If we've both read our Shakespeare, I've just communicated hours worth of information to you in half a second by making that comparison. And so, the kind of richness of the terminology that we're using around us is there if we have the time and the ability to do it. But of course, we're all limited by our own experience and things like that. And it's a particular issue for writers. I mean, there's philosophers who insist on only using plain English terms. But if when they get to a certain level of complexity, they're using the plain English term, but they don't mean what that word means anymore. Yes. But they don't want to go full Heidegger on you and sort of just make up brand new terms every sentence. So, it's just and it's an interesting challenge now so you've got words that you use like rough out and eagerness and way words and things like that. And I really like how you're gently introducing them, but in the context of, I'm aware of the complexity that I'm introducing here.
Yeah. And it's a weird thing too, because I have to be judicious about this, because otherwise it just turns into this thing, which is kind of like, will people take the time to decipher this and basically whether that's going to present value to them. But that whole nuance thing to me is fascinating. And the entire thing where words become overloaded with meanings because they have to be the closest to the thing that you want to discuss, but they're not quite it, And it's kind of rough sometimes. But to me it's very enjoyable, and it's to a degree people find it helpful. I'm very happy.
Yeah. It's I just to harp on this point, just one more beat, because I mean, it's to me this is just like such an important challenge. I mean, you write about how I'm going to quote you back at yourself a little bit. We've all been in technical conversations where people talk past each other because they mean slightly different things by the words they use. But you also talk about how sometimes it's actually really crucial that we clarify. And I've had this, I'm sort of get worked up with this because I've had this experience before, and it's very frustrating where you can if you're part of a conversation and you can see two people diverging, and it seems minor in the moment, but that if it goes, they go off in their own direction with this slightly different understanding, they're going to come back having done from the other's perspective, the other person's done the wrong thing. Yeah. And here's the real problem. If you intervene, all the eyes turn to you, and people are like, why are you being so, why are you pushing your glasses up your nose and interrupting us about this tiny detail? I don't know. I just, it's just an interesting human problem at that point.
Yeah. Here's a consulting trick a little bit with that. It's kind of like when that starts to happen, if you just sort of say, hey, this thing we're talking about right now, let's just go and remember this and figure what you're like, what's that about? And then when the divergence happens, you can gently say, hey, you remember when I said, let's remember this? Kind of like, just really gently. It's kind of like, then you're kind of like introducing the notion that there's predecessors to the problem, right? And it's kind of like, be aware of those predecessors, helps you avoid it in the future. But it's like, you're really having to enlist people at that point, getting them to go and sort of like see through the example of their struggle, that there's a problem, and, point back to something that kind of fixes it.
I'll try and remember that trick. Thanks for that. And so one of the interesting things about working with AI when you're programming, with anything really, is the problem of hallucination. What are your thoughts on how people who are, producing programs that might be going out there in the world and might involve security weaknesses, they might do bad, unintended things. How do you handle the problem of hallucination when you're using AI to assist you when you're programming?
I guess it comes down to how you're actually using it. And I think one of the fascinating things right now is that there are many, many people that are working to go and try to make deterministic code generation possible, right? That something that maintains the creativity, but gives you things that are definitely going to work. And people going in and saying, okay, well, here's the response I want to give the user, but I'm going to go and actually run it to a compiler first and see that's syntactically correct. And you can do things with, using tests as a way of going and verifying that what's generated is good. But we have this real push towards that determinism, because that precision is what we really need in engineering to avoid trouble. But there's this whole other realm, which is really all about like ideation and creativity. And it's like, if I can think about this problem that I have and ask for 4 different ways of solving it, and then kind of compare them against each other, I may not use any of them, but that might go and move me into a different thought space that allows me to see another possible solution. So I think these 2 different areas are kind of like lumped together under AI use right now. And I think that they require some different strategies as well. It's kind of a fascinating area right now.
Yeah. One question that's come up on the podcast quite a few times in the past is because so many people on the podcast were computer science, majors at some point in their lives. And I did, in the context of AI and AI assisted programming, if you were starting out now and you've majored in architecture and you've switched to math and now you decided, no, I want to be a programmer, would you do a 4-year degree in computer science?
Well, I think it's an interesting issue for education at all, right? And it's like, look, publishing books, it's like, oh, what are we doing? It's like, maybe we won't have books, right? But it's, I know it's an interesting thing. It depends on how deep you want to go and get in it. I think the transition that a lot of us have made is that we are problem solvers, right? And technology is just one of the tools that we use to go and solve problems. And I think for anybody that's moving into software development, that's a very powerful frame to have. Because sometimes the best solution requires no code at all, for instance. Now, getting into the depth of these things is probably going to go and help you deal with all different levels of the stack. And that's good if you want to go and have that kind of comprehensive view of things. But I think the thing that AI is going to move us towards is just really the thing of going and finding different ways of solving problems, being confronted by different ways of solving problems and be able to go and assess them against and compare them against each other. And I think I noticed over and over again with AI is that it's like I start asking better questions the more I interact with it. So it ends up being an amplifier of whatever you have. And it's like it makes us better as we're doing things. And I think that's really the message to give people who are really concerned about the job prospects and stuff like that, is that, you using it, you get better. And that's a very valuable thing,
It's very interesting. I had years ago Jerry Weinberg on the podcast.
Oh, wow. Yeah. We met him once. It's such a cool guy. Yeah.
Oh, did you? Oh, yeah. No, he was great. He had this great anecdote, and I hope I get it right because I've retold it a few times, but how he was in the early days of IBM getting into kind of computers. He was in a meeting and there were basically a bunch of suits. And when they learned that programming wasn't something you just did once, they were just incredibly dejected because they just saw this future. Now we're going to have programmers in their head. In their head, it was just like, it was kind of like, design the machine, right? And then we've got the machine design and we're done with those guys or those people.
Yeah.
And then, realizing, oh no, we're going to, so a lot of people think when, things like AI come up, when automation comes up in general, people think, oh, so is the dream of those suits going to come true? And
I think so. I think the interesting thing with technology is that whenever we solve many problems with technology, we want more. It's kind of like there's that general thing. It's like people are going to want much more complicated and involved software than we're capable of producing today. And that's just going to be true always, I think. I think the interesting thing as well is that, I don't know, I've been asking myself this question for a while, whether source code goes away at some point. And I think we're probably always going to have it because we need to be able to audit and see what things are doing. But I can also imagine cases where it will go away just because, you train up an LLM or something, concert of things working together to develop systems or to produce answers for people. And it can be a bit more autonomous in a way, but that might be in domains where it isn't critical to be right, for instance, that kind of thing. Like gaming and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's super fascinating because, you mentioned working in healthcare and stuff like that. And I've interviewed people who've worked in like healthcare and defense and banking and gambling and things like that, where like there's like, the regulation in gambling is a little bit different.
Yeah, lots of money, lots of lives.
It's the money at stake and the other people's lives that are affected by it. But like, and this sort of predates the kind of AI discussion about, the sort of machine learning or deep learning kind of black box, It could be that things where the outcome is the most serious, like can this, injection cure cancer? And like, if a machine produces a formula for you for a medicine that can cure cancer, and it does, we're going to use it probably, whether we understand where it came from or how it works or not.
Yeah. And it's like, I love to remind people that essentially this has already happened. It's kind of like prior to what we're calling AI today, we've had a lot of machine learning stuff that actually finds its way into autonomous vehicles, medical diagnostics, and all these things. And it's kind of like, in both those cases, our fallback is to have a human in the loop, right? It's kind of like there is a radiologist that looks at this and basically goes and sees the scan as well as the recommendation and stuff along those lines, right? But yeah, it's really conundrum, and I think a lot of them just really comes down to cost benefit. And essentially once the risk is low enough, right, because it's been ameliorated by what you're doing, then you're going to go and jump for it, and you can say, yeah, I can use this now, just because the cost of errors are so low. So a lot of what we do is drive that cost of error down as much as possible. So, yeah.
One just very speculative thing I wanted to touch.
Sure,
just for fun. Yeah, just for fun. Is so right now there's this explosion of investment in AI companies like OpenAI and stuff like that. Ones you've never heard of are getting hundreds of millions of dollars of investment, and for anyone who knows the name of the company, NVIDIA now and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people. There's there's a popular person on Twitter named Ed Zitron who's just sort of jumping up and down, going, "It's all a fraud." AI is useless. Hardly anybody comes back and uses ChatGPT again after their first time. On the spectrum of, it's going to completely transform the world and it's a total fraud. Where do you land?
I don't know. It's really hard to go and know just where it is going to land, right? Where it's going to land as opposed to where I think it's going to land. But it's like the thing that I keep coming back to is that the incentives are there and they're extremely powerful to go and actually automate as much as we can, right? We've done this for ages with computers and even prior to that with the Industrial Revolution. So yeah, there's a lot of money to be made by going and doing this kind of thing. And so I think we're going to keep on pushing forward with it, and we're going to create new problems, unfortunately, but that's what happens with technological change. It's like nobody talks about the Turing test anymore, kind of like, right. Is something conscious by, determined by interacting. And it's kind of, the silence about that is kind of amazing. Nobody really talks about that anymore. But it's gonna kind of move forward and change things. I mean, what's interesting to me really are what are going to be the cultural changes that happen, right? The things that, it's like if you have kids and they're like 7 years old, what are they going to be confronted when they're 20? And just, the way it changes how society works and all these other things. It's wild.
Yeah, no, it totally. Yeah, no, thanks. I mean, that reminds me, I had a conversation with someone the other day where we were talking about how, when you say to someone, pre kind of AI, I'm an author, that, you can write texts and you can write coherent ones that are kind of maybe meaningful or interesting or entertaining or creative. Let's say someone who's just, like 5 now, and they can go on ChatGPT and they can do, like, I sort of, used it the other day to produce a demo book for Leanpub. And I was like, I want to make, I'm writing a fantasy novel about, a young peasant farmer whose land gets invaded by a marauding army and he gets conscripted. And then he secretly leads a revolt against the king, and it wrote 2 good genre fiction paragraphs for me. And that's one. So when it comes to the kind of wild questions, it's like, what do you make of someone claiming to be an author 10 years from now, if you've grown up with the ability to just kind of produce coherent text yourself with some prompting?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I don't know what it would call the person who does what we do today an author at that point, right? And I think one of the things that's kind of interesting is that there's this social thing that happens quite often when something becomes too easy, it becomes almost like low class in a way. It's kind of like with photography. It's like, oh, okay, well, it's like doing realistic, oil painting. It's like, it makes no sense anymore because now anybody can take a picture, that kind of thing. But then it takes a while for it to actually become an art, right? And what that usually is basically somebody working with the technology in a very novel way. And so I think, we're still in early days of that sort of thing, thinking about, what is the value add that a human can go give to generated things. And I think, there's also this thing too about art, which is that, we basically give it much more credence when humans are involved because we get to kind of like occupy them, just project ourselves onto them and that kind of thing. And it becomes like this thing socially, right? So I think we're always going to have a human in the loop for those things just because we love humans, we're humans. And the real interesting thing is to basically see how basically the creativity we have interacting with the tools is going to go and propel us forward.
Yeah, no, that leads me to a couple of observations. One is that, the whole thing about AI is it's always been questions about ourselves, right? Like, that's when we get concerned about it or nervous about it. Like AI might destroy the world. And it's like, hello, look in the mirror, humanity, and that's why, the fear of
I love when people talk about alignment with AI and kind of like, we can't even align humans. What the hell?
I know. And it's the questions, it's often the questions we're asking about AI are the questions we avoid asking about ourselves, which is, the old kind of like somewhat left-wing joke that concerns about automation are really just concerns about capitalism. But it's interesting too that like when something becomes everyday, it can become cheapened, but then it can also be, I don't know how to put this, like there's always this with a certain people with a certain kind of mindset, even to this day, the computer itself is this kind of alien thing. They're like, I don't understand it. I don't know it. I don't know how to interact with it. I don't know how it works. There's something mysterious about it. And it could be that like, with GPT that actually like finally people get over the alienness of it, kind of ironically, because now, I was a friend of mine's partner is a university administrator. And one of his jobs at the beginning of the year is to plan a day for introducing foreign students, freshers to the university. Yeah. And what he does is he goes on ChatGPT. I need to plan 9 events for the day. I'm a university administrator, blah, blah, blah. And he gets this little syllabus for the day in a minute. That person would have never, probably in the past, would have been very scared to have used an app to, do something like that. But now it's just like a little.
And, I think that's a weird thing for people who are involved with computers now is that essentially our views of what's possible are from the past, right? And so it's people are novices and basically children, for the most part. They'll probably use things in very interesting, novel ways. So there's a framework called Ruby on Rails, right? And if you've heard about that, right? So David Heinemeier Hansson basically was not a programmer at the time when he developed this. And there's this technique that's used in Ruby on Rails called metaprogramming, where you're able to go and like work on the class of the class and all these other things. And for years before that, people were talking about how philosophically strange that is and how dangerous it is to go and modify code at runtime. And he just looked and said, hey, here's a tool I can use. I'll just go ahead and do it. And he just ran wild with it. And he ended up creating something really useful and wonderful. But it's because it wasn't an alien thing to him. It was kind of like, okay, let's see if it does this. And then with the beginner's mind, it's kind of like you just can end up in a completely different space.
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, there's that excitement. There's that excitement to it as well. As you say, that's an interesting, could be that to some extent being old hands holds us back. In the last part of the interview, I always like to talk to people about their process as a writer. And so you're publishing this book, your latest book, In Progress. And I was wondering how you're approaching that. Do you have a plan? Like, I'm going to write a chapter every Saturday afternoon. Do you have an outline? How are you approaching that?
It's interesting because I started with an outline, but I basically consider I'm going to kind of throw it away. And generally speaking, for me, it's a very bottom-up process. And with the first book I wrote, it really became that. With that one, I had like a plan, and I was basically going and writing a lot of preliminary material that was theoretical, and then get to the practical things later on. And then I looked at it, I said, nobody's going to read the preliminary stuff. What am I doing here? And what I did is I basically rewrote the entire book just by going and saying, here's the chapter. The chapter's name is the name of a problem. And then here's everything I could do to basically tell you how to solve that problem, right? And it was kind of a novel way of approaching things, that every chapter title was a question. And that kind of was able to kind of follow me in the right way. Right now for this book, I'm really writing in strategies and nomenclature as separate things. And I really don't know what the outer, shape is going to go and be. And I've actually said to people, they're reading it in progress, that, expect the top level to vary quite a bit. But right now I'm getting the things down. I'm dealing with the details and sort of like going and building up from that. And I, have confidence that I'll have a set of strategies, aligned, as I basically finish those.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's one of the really interesting things I've got to say about, working for Leanpub is, the getting to see authors approach these things and how their projects change over time. And how interestingly, there's a very tiny sliver of the world that knows about in progress kind of publishing, and the fact that it's not just serial, but it means you kind of go back and change things that you've already written.
It's wonderful. I had a friend who was working for a publisher.
Sorry?
No, so I had a friend who was working with a publisher that won't be named, but essentially the contract that they wrote had them delivering like 3 chapters at a time, I believe, until it was finished. And once you deliver them, you can't change them at all. And I'm like, that's just impossible. How do you even do that? Right? It's just like a very bizarre thing to even imagine being possible.
Yeah, it's funny because from the publisher's side, it's like, you want to change it? That's not possible.
No, that's wild. I think, getting back to process for me a little bit, I think it's like I'm writing these things kind of bottom up, but it's like almost every week, what I'm doing now is just rereading everything. And that's some kind of like being able to go and sort of like make sure that everything's synchronizing well. And of course, I'm invariably going to go and find little typos and stuff like that, or rewordings that I think are going to improve the text. But I did that with the first one too. It's like just rereading, and modifying the things that are already there, as well as, at the same time, I'm adding new things.
Yeah, I got to say, I'm very much the same way when I'm writing something. It's like read the whole thing, read it again, read it again. Deleting is sometimes the easiest and sometimes the hardest thing to do.
Yeah, what's it? Kill your darlings, I guess.
Kill your darlings, something like that. So the last question I always ask on the podcast, if the guest is an author who's been using Leanpub, is if there's one magical feature we could build for you, or if there's one thing when you go to work on the Leanpub side of things that has you shaking your fist going, damn you, Leanpub, why is this so awful, that we could fix for you? Can you think of anything you would ask us?
Well, I was writing last night and I just basically thought of, something that might help with that. And it's, one thing was basically the markdown language. It's kind of like, I know that there's stuff online that describes it, but it shows you the actual markdown without showing you what the result would look like graphically. So I have to try things out to do that. And I guess secondarily, it's kind of like tied to that. It's kind of like the thing of like, can there be a mode where basically you just render a PDF for just like 1 or 2 pages or a single chapter at a time? That feature might be there and I'm just not really aware of it.
Those are 2 really great suggestions. The idea of like, so for anyone listening, Leanpub, you write in plain text. That plain text includes the formatting instructions for how the book is going to look. So if you want something to be in italics, you don't see it in italics. You put an asterisk before and after the word, say. And the way Leanpub works is you write your book, you type in your formatting instructions. Some of them are global settings that you do elsewhere. Then you click a button and you cross your fingers and you're like, I hope it looks like I want it to. We don't have currently as a kind of live editor on the right. So you could write on the left and have a live thing on the right showing you what it's going to look like.
And it's like, honestly, it doesn't even have to go that far. It can just basically be the thing, can I just render this one page using the current global settings? And I don't know, that might be enough rapidity of feedback to make a difference. But.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting suggestion. We've had that before. We do have a sort of medium term plan for like a WYSIWYG editor. So that will probably solve a lot of those problems. When it comes to, we do have a subset feature on the preview page where you can preview just a subset. You create a text file in your manuscript folder called subset.txt.
Oh, cool.
I think. I hope I'm getting this right. It's described on the preview page. If the feature hasn't been deprecated, I think it's still there.
Cool.
But yeah, that's been asked for before, and I think it's just the PDF, so you don't have to wait for the book generator to publish everything. The other kind of hacky thing is the way Leanpub books are generated. There's a manuscript folder with some text files in it, and you have a file called book.txt, and that's the list of files and like list of chapters in order, basically. And what you can do is you can just delete all the chapters that you don't want to run from book.txt.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
See what I mean? And that's a kind of hacky way of doing it too.
Yeah, no, I think that'll help. Cool thing.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for taking some time out of what I'm sure is a beautiful California afternoon
Thanks so much.
to talk to us and to be on the podcast. And thank you very much for using Leanpub as the platform for this book. I'm really excited to see how it's going to turn out.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks for your conversations. It's been wonderful.